Sabbath-keepers in the 13th century. Example 1, the Waldenses. They say that the blessed Pope Sylvester was the Antichrist, of whom mention is made in the epistles of St. Paul as having been the son of perdition. They also say that the keeping of the Sabbath ought to take place. Source: Ecclesiastical History of the Ancient Churches of Piedmont. By prominent Roman Catholic author writing about Waldenses. Example 2, in France, the Waldenses. To destroy completely these heretics, Pope Innocent III sent Dominican inquisitors into France, and also crusaders, promising a plenary remission of all sins to those who took on them the crusade against the Albigenses. Source: Catholic Encyclopedia. Example 3, in France, the Waldenses. The inquisitors declare that the sign of a Vaudois, deemed worthy of death, was that he followed Christ and sought to obey the commandments for God. Source: History of the Inquisition of the Middle Ages, H.C. Less. Example 4, in France, the Waldenses. The heresy of the Vaudois, or poor people of Lyons, is of great antiquity, for some say that it has been continued down ever since the time of Pope Sylvester, and others, ever since that of the Apostles. Source: The Roman Inquisitor, Reinera Sacco. Example 5, in France. Thousands of God's people were tortured to death by the Inquisition, buried alive, burned to death, or hacked to pieces by the Crusaders. While devastating the city of Biter, the soldiers asked the Catholic leaders how they should know who were heretics. Slay them all, for the Lord knows who is his. Source: History of the Inquisition. Example 6, in France, King Louis IX, 1229 AD. Published the statute, Cupientes, in which he charges himself to clear southern France from heretics, as the Sabbath-keepers were called. Example 7, in France, the Council of Toulouse, 1229 AD. Canons against Sabbath-keepers, Canon 3. The lords of the different districts shall have the villas, houses and woods diligently searched, and the hiding places of the heretics destroyed. Canon 14. Lay members are not allowed to possess the books of either the Old or the New Testaments. Source: Hefele. Example 8, in Europe. The Paulicians, Petrobusinas, Pasaginians, Waldenses and Insabbatati were great Sabbath-keeping bodies of Europe down to 1250 AD. Example 9, the Pasaginians, Waldenses. Dr. Hahn says that if the Pasaginians referred to the fourth commandment to support the Sabbath, the Roman priests answered, the Sabbath symbolized the eternal rest of the saints. Example 10, in Mongolia. The Mongolian conquest did not injure the Church of the East. Sabbath-keeping. On the contrary, a number of the Mongolian princes and a larger number of Mongolian queens were members of this church. Sabbath-keepers in the 14th century. Example 1, the Waldenses. That we are to worship one only God, who is able to help us, and not the saints departed, that we ought to keep holy the Sabbath day. Source: Luther's Forerunners. Example 2, the Insabbati. For centuries evangelical bodies, especially the Waldenses, were called Insabbati because of Sabbath-keeping. Source: Gué, Manuel Inquisiteur. Example 3, in Bohemia, 1310, modern Czechoslovakia. In 1310, 200 years before Luther's theses, the Bohemian Brethren constituted 1/4 of the population of Bohemia, and that they were in touch with the Waldenses who abounded in Austria, Lombardy, Bohemia, North Germany, Thuringia, Brandenburg, and Moravia. Erasmus pointed out how strictly Bohemian Waldenses kept the seventh-day Sabbath. Source: Armitage, A History of the Baptists. Example 4, in Norway. Then, too, in the Catechism that was used during the 14th century, the Sabbath commandment read thus: Thou shalt not forget to keep the seventh day. Source: This is quoted from Documents and Studies Concerning the History of the Lutheran Catechism in the Nordic Churches. Example 5, in Norway. Also the priests have caused the people to keep Saturdays as Sundays. Source: Theological Periodicals for the Evangelical Lutheran Church in Norway. Example 6, in England, Holland and Bohemia. We wrote of the Sabbatarians in Bohemia, Transylvania, England and Holland between 1250 and 1600 AD. Source: Truth Triumphant, Wilkinson. Sabbath keepers in the 15th century. Example 1, in Bohemia. Erasmus testifies that even as late as about 1500 these Bohemians not only kept the seventh day scrupulously, but also were called Sabbatarians. Source: Cox, The Literature of the Sabbath Question. Example 2, in Norway, Church Council held at Bergen, August 22, 1435. The first matter concerned a keeping holy of Saturday. It had come to the earth of the archbishop that people in different places of the kingdom had ventured the keeping holy of Saturday. It is strictly forbidden, it is stated in the church law, for anyone to keep or to adopt holy days, outside of those which the pope, archbishop, or bishops appoint. Source: The History of the Norwegian Church under Catholicism, R. Kaiser. Example 3, 1435 AD, Catholic Provincial Council at Bergen. We are informed that some people in different districts of the kingdom have adopted and observed Saturday keeping. It is severely forbidden in Holy Church Canon 1 and all to observe days excepting those which the Holy Pope Archbishop, or the bishops command. Saturday keeping must under no circumstances be permitted hereafter further than the Church Canon commands. Therefore, we counsel all the friends of God throughout all Norway who want to be obedient towards the Holy Church to let this evil of Saturday keeping alone, and the rest we forbid under penalty of severe church punishment to keep Saturday holy. Source: Dip. Norveg. Church Conference at Oslo. Example 4, in Norway. It is forbidden under the same penalty to keep Saturday holy by refraining from labor. Source: History of the Norwegian Church. Example 5, in France, the Waldenses. Louis XII, King of France, 1498–1515, being informed by the enemies of the Waldense inhabiting a part of the province of Provence, that several heinous crimes were laid to their account, sent the Master of Requests, and a certain doctor of the Sorbonne, to make inquiry into this matter. On their return they reported that they had visited all the parishes, but could not discover any traces of those crimes with which they were charged. On the contrary, they kept the Sabbath day, observed the ordinance of baptism, according to the primitive church, instructed their children in the articles of the Christian faith, and the commandments of God. The king, having heard the report of his commissioners, said with an oath that they were better men than himself or his people. Source: History of the Christian Church. Example 6, in India. Separated from the Western world for 1,000 years, they were naturally ignorant of many novelties introduced by the councils and decrees of the Lateran. "We are Christians, and not idolaters," was their expressive reply when required to do homage to the image of the Virgin Mary. Sabbath keepers in the 16th century. Example 1, in England. In the reign of Elizabeth, it occurred to many conscientious and independent thinkers, as it previously had done to some Protestants in Bohemia, that the fourth commandment required of them the observance, not of the first, but of the specified seventh day of the week. Source: Chambers' Cyclopedia, article, Sabbath. Example 2, in Russia, Council, Moscow, 1593. The accused, Sabbath-keepers, were summoned, they openly acknowledged the new faith, and defended the same. The most eminent of them, the Secretary of State, Kuritzin, Ivan Maximo, Kashin, Archimandrite of the Fury Monastery of Novgorod, were condemned to death, and burned publicly in cages, at Moscow, December 17, 1503. Source: H. Sternberfy, Geschick der Juden. Example 3, in Sweden. This zeal for Saturday keeping continued for a long time, even little things which might strengthen the practice of keeping Saturday were punished. Source: Bishop Andrew, Svenska Kyrkans Historia after Motethiers, UPS. Example 4, the Liechtenstein family. Estates in Austria, Bohemia, Moravia, Hungary. Liechtenstein in the Rhine Valley wasn't their country until the end of the 7th century. The Sabbatarians teach that the outward Sabbath, i.e. Saturday, still must be observed. They say that Sunday is the Pope's invention. Source: Refutation of Sabbath, by Wolfgang Capito. Example 5, in Bohemia, the Bohemian Brethren. Dr. R. Cox says, I find from a passage in Erasmus that at the early period of the Reformation when he wrote, there were Sabbatarians in Bohemia, who not only kept the seventh day, but were said to be scrupulous in resting on it. Source: Literature of the Sabbath Question, Cox. Example 6, Historian's List of Churches, 16th century. Sabbatarians, so called because they reject the observance of the Lord's Day as not commanded in Scripture, they consider the Sabbath alone to be holy, as God rested on that day and commanded to keep it holy and to rest on it. Source: A. Ross. Example 7, in Germany. Dr. Esk, while refuting the Reformers, however, the Church has transferred the observance from Saturday to Sunday by virtue of her own power, without Scripture. Source: Dr. Esk's Enchiridion. Example 8, the Princes of Liechtenstein, Europe. About the year 1520 many of these Sabbath keepers found shelter on the estate of Lord Leonhard of Liechtenstein held to the observance of the true Sabbath. Source: J. N. Andrews, History of the Sabbath. Example 9, in India. The famous Jesuit, Francis Xavier, called for the Inquisition, which was set up in Goa, India, in 1560, to check the Jewish wickedness, Sabbath-keeping. Source: Adonai, the Greek and Eastern Churches. Example 10, in Norway, 1544 AD. Some of you, contrary to the warning, keep Saturday. You ought to be severely punished. Whoever shall be found keeping Saturday, must pay a fine of 10 marks. Source: History of King Christian III, Niels Krag and S. Stephanius. Example 11, in Austria. Sabbatarians now exist in Austria. Source: Luther, Lectures on Genesis. A.D. 1523-1527, Example 12, in Abyssinia, AD 1534. Abyssinian legate at court of Lisbon, it is not therefore, in imitation of the Jews, but in obedience to Christ and his holy apostles, that we observe the day. Source: Geddes Church History of Ethiopia. Example 13, Dr. Martin Luther. God blessed the Sabbath and sanctified it to himself. God willed that this command concerning the Sabbath should remain. He willed that on the seventh day the word should be preached. Source: Commentary on Genesis. Example 14, the Baptists. Some have suffered torture because they would not rest when others kept Sunday, for they declared it to be the holiday and law of Antichrist. Source: Sebastian Frank, AD 1536. Example 15, in Finland, December 6, 1554. King Gustavus Vasa I, of Sweden's letter to the people of Finland. Some time ago we heard that some people in Finland had fallen into a great error and observed the seventh day, called Saturday. Source: State Library at Helsingfors, Riksregister, Vom J, Example 16, in Switzerland. The observance of the Sabbath is a part of the moral law. It has been kept holy since the beginning of the world. Source: Ref. Noted Swiss writer, R. Huspinian. Example 17, in Holland and Germany. Barbara of Thiers, who was executed in 1529, declared, God has commanded us to rest on the seventh day. Another martyr, Christina Tillingerin, is mentioned thus, concerning holy days and Sundays, she said, in 6 days the Lord made the world, on the seventh day he rested. The other holy days have been instituted by popes, cardinals, and archbishops. Source: Martyrology of the Churches of Christ, commonly called Baptists, during the era of the Reformation, from the Dutch of T. J. van Bright.